Hello and welcome to another in our series on state and local governments. Today we're going to be talking about the military. This series is being brought to you by the American Democracy Project here at IPFW, as well as the Departments of History and Political Science at IPFW. Joining us today are people all from the Department of History, I can say. Over on my far right, Rick Weiner from the Department of History. Next, Ann Livshiz from the Department of History, and then Eleanor Hanna from the Department of History. We're not going to waste any time. We like to jump into these conversations right away. For people, they have sort of a certain conception of what military is. They may think of it in terms of people who provide aid after a flood. They may think of it in terms of insurgents who are holding down an insurrection. When do we really sort of see the emergence of our modern conception of military? Eleanor?
The modern military, I mean, from a military history perspective, the modern military emerges sometime in the middle of the 1800s. That's a combination of reaction to trends in professionalization and education and training, changes in warfare itself. Some of the things that I know we're going to talk about today, are a little bit older than that, like the concept of the citizen soldier, for example. We really see that arise in the age of revolutions, right, in the 1700s. So it's an evolutionary process.
Anne?
I mean, I think I would agree with that. I mean, we really, the French Revolution, at least from the point of view of Europe, certainly the French Revolution is a key turning point in the reconceptualization of the place the military plays in society, and individual members of the military play in society. And we see trends in this direction over the course of the 19th and into the 20th century.
Rick?
Well, in the case of Latin America, since the Age of Independence, there's a strong militarization that takes place. It's called the era of caudillo rule or strongman rule. But this is not the professionalization of the military. So this is the early 19th century. In Latin America, it becomes more professionalized. There's calls for actually training and guidance from Germany and France in the late 19th century. Into the early 20th century, you begin to have military training schools. And then into the mid-20th century, the United States begins to play a larger role in the training of Latin American militaries.
We do actually have some slides that will be showing on the screen while we're talking. They depict actually World War I recruitment posters, so I hope people are able to enjoy those. But as those are showing on the screen, let's talk a little bit about some terminology that we hear thrown around: voluntary service versus universal military service. Eleanor, why don't you get us started? Explain those terms for us, define those for us, if you would, please.
Okay, well, I mean, basically, in order to find enough soldiers, right, boots on the ground, states have a choice between compulsory recruitment, that is, you must come serve in the military, and there are bad penalties if you don't, all the way through inviting people to serve as a form of patriotism or because they're committed to a cause. And those are, those basic two poles of that spectrum are quite old. They date, back to the age of Rome and forward. As we move, though, into this modern period where there's a perception that military science is a thing that you need to study, that it takes knowledge, it takes practice, there's skill acquisition involved, the idea is that more and more people need a little bit of basic training, even to become a foot soldier. And tying that into the concept of the citizen soldier, that each citizen has a responsibility to respond to the call to serve if the state finds that they are in such straits that they need more soldiers. The idea of universal military training developed in the 19th century at the same time that the military training schools are growing up for officers, for example, that you want every citizen, and of course at this period we're talking only about the men, to have some period of basic training, introduction to military organization and hierarchy, the basic weapons that you'd be using, the basic commands that you'd be responding to, some of the basic rituals of living together in large groups, sanitary rules, those kinds of things. That will, in the 20th century, get broadened out into the concept of universal military service. So sometimes they're abbreviated UMT or UMS, that, not everybody really needs to be trained to be a soldier. There are those who, for religious or personal reasons, are pacifists for example, and in the United States that's always been recognized. And of course, for the early part of the 20th century, women were prohibited from serving in the military, but as women gain the vote and are perceived to be citizens, then the idea is that they should also perform some form of service to the state as an expression of their citizenship. So that's where these terms come from.
Yeah.
I think one of the interesting things that we see, especially in the 19th and 20th century, is that as the nature of warfare changes and the needs of the state's military establishments change, the attitude towards what percentage of the population needs to be somehow incorporated into the military changes as well. So, early 20th century, the size of the military grows dramatically, and so there's the move towards expanding. There's the expansion of who is eligible to serve and who needs to be served. The idea that you don't need a professional army, but rather all the able-bodied men of a certain age should be serving in the military. And it's interesting to see how that has changed over the course of the 20th century, especially to the present day. In part because, again, the changes in the nature of warfare and the fact that we don't really expect to have kind of a very large military. The technology kind of makes up for the need in large size, and so many countries have been gradually moving away from the idea that all men need to go through some kind of basic training or military training. Although there's still some countries, usually smaller sized countries, that still have that. Kind of a great example is the case of Switzerland, for example, where all men from ages of 18 to 34 have to go through military training. Now, granted, Switzerland doesn't get involved in wars. The military is only used for international peacekeeping, and yet this is something that's expected of all men of that age, and they get to keep their weapons at home. So that's kind of so that seems kind of potentially fun. Or Israel, where again everybody, men and women, are expected to serve in the military. Men for 3 years, women for 2 years, and that is simply the kind of the expectation of citizenship. And some remain in the reserve, but the idea is that this is something that absolutely everybody in the country has to go through.
It's interesting that in some respects our need is shrinking at the time when to become a soldier you really have to have a lot more technical knowledge. So it is sort of interesting that there's this shift going on. Rick, anything about Latin America?
Well, interestingly, there haven't been so many major wars which have required a draft. People think about Latin America as militaristic, and it certainly has elements of that. But the major wars that required many people fighting ended up being the wars for independence, which lasted in some places 15 to 20 years, which is much longer than the United States. I think an average of Mexico, they talked about maybe up to 500,000 people dying. So these were really very extensive wars. In those instances, a lot of slaves were emancipated, particularly in places like Venezuela, Colombia, and it was service for freedom. If we move to the more modern period, since there haven't been that many wars, there haven't been many drafts, and so there hasn't been as much pacifism or resistance to service. But one interesting example, when in the 1970s and 80s, in the case of Nicaragua, where a revolutionary government took control, and they were fighting to maintain that control, and the United States was funding another group that was working to overthrow them under Ronald Reagan and putting a lot of money into it. Everybody had to serve, men and women, starting as teenagers. And that revolutionary government was actually voted, they were in power from 1979 to 1990. One reason some people say they were voted out is because people knew that if that government, the Sandinistas, maintained power, then the United States would continue funding the war against them. Everybody would continue having to serve in the military. I mean, it's a complicated case, but this was one factor. So I guess the case of Latin America contrasts a bit with the United States in terms of drafts.
Sure. Well, it's important to remember that in the United States, we've never had UMS or UMT. It was an idea, it was floated, there were enthusiastic supporters of it, but it's never happened in the U.S. We have never had universal service or universal military training. It never came to be. Instead, when we've needed to raise large numbers for military emergencies, we've gone with a draft, which is different, right? That's total compulsory service, although it is based on the notion of the citizen soldier, that service is a responsibility and a right of citizenship. And if you're a citizen, when the state needs you, you have to go serve.
Right. And in the case of Latin America, because they haven't really been there's been very few external wars, and consequently, even the draft is something that wasn't required.
It's an idea out there.
Yeah.
But
Now, you both actually mentioned this idea of pacifists, people who, for one reason or another, are, in some respects, given the ability to do something other than serve in the military. What sort of things are we talking about? Eleanor, you mentioned pacifists first, so I'll start with you. What do folks who do not, for some reason, don't have to serve in the military, what do they do in lieu of that usually?
well, it sort of depends on the time and the need. I mean, remember, one of our original 13 colonies is Pennsylvania. It's set up by Quakers, who are pacifists. That's an important theological tenet of Quakerism. And so from the beginning, the colony of Pennsylvania recognized the right of Quakers not to serve. And it simply, at that time and place, was to not serve. You didn't go. You didn't do anything. As society and the military have both grown more complex, and there's a lot more functions that you might perform in order to forward the national effort, there are alternatives. I mean, in general, though, I think in the United States, even through the Vietnam War, if you could prove that you were a Quaker, for example, you just simply don't serve, even if you've been drafted. You don't have to do anything else. Where they have established universal military training, or or that year of, or 2 years or 3 years of commitment to the state, there I think they have experimented with alternative forms of service for people who are pacifists. But in the United States, it's just if you're a pacifist. Now, if you're a draft resistor, that's a political position, and that's a different argument that individual's having with the state. Then you go to jail. But that's often the point. So.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's interesting that we see greater emphasis on providing alternative opportunities in European countries. And again, perhaps, and I think that it's certainly kind of an evolution because of the European experience in countries like Austria, for example, and Germany, over the course of the 20th century, where there was an effort in the last couple of decades to provide great opportunities, not so much for people who are, registered pacifists, but rather who perhaps would like to do some other kind of service. And it's seen as a potential positive, especially in places like Germany and Austria, as a way to provide opportunities for people to contribute to society, but not necessarily through the military. So Germany, for example, has opportunities for young men to perform services in places like hospices. In Germany also there is a sort of the opportunity to work in a developing country to provide, if you sort of have some kind of specific training. I mean, the country has to approve of you and find that you have useful skills to contribute. And one of the consequences of this is that some have suggested that the disproportionately high percentage of German nationals that we see in international aid today is actually as a result of those people performing an alternative service and kind of getting so involved in it that they want to stay and continue to work there. In Austria, an alternative service is working in Holocaust remembrance institutions, kind of as a way for, again, as an alternative, kind of a very interesting one, given the history of those countries.
Rick, let's start talking a little bit about voluntary service. Who serves? When there is voluntary service, who serves in Latin America?
Well, if we're going to, I'm a historian. If we look at this historically, we had an interesting development if we go all the way back to the colonial period. In contrast to the British colonies, in the Spanish colonies, it was the natives who served as the rank and file. And one of the interesting points is that colonial Latin America wasn't really ruled and controlled militarily in a significant way. The emergence in really the 3- or 4-fold increase of the military in the colonial period was a consequence of European wars, and particularly the British taking control over Cuba, and this concern about not internal control, but external threats. So late 18th century, there's a huge increase in the military to protect against foreign invasions. The British trying to go into Argentina would be another example. And what we had at that time when that military was formed was a racialized army. The top of the army, the top would be the Europeans. The Spaniards would be on top. Underneath them in the hierarchy would be the group that are called Creoles, which it's a term for people who were supposedly of European descent but born in America. Underneath that, the rank and file would be just the Indians. And I suppose in the British case, since the Indians were not integrated into colonial society, that wasn't really an option for them, so they brought British soldiers over.
Eleanor, let's since Rick did make reference to the United States, what's it like in the United States, at least historically, in terms of voluntary service? Is there this racialization that Rick mentioned? What do we see in the United States in terms of who serves in the voluntary military?
Okay, well, actually in this case, much like the Spanish Empire, there was virtually no military presence in the colonies until they finally went to war with France for the control of the interior of North America. At that point, then, the British experimented both the shipping over complete regiments raised in Europe, raised in England primarily, obviously, and then sending over officers to raise regiments in the colonies, which was an extension of how the colonies had defended themselves against each other, against Native American, to expand the frontier, take more territory from the Native Americans. And they did that through local service, a complex hybrid of kind of draft, compulsory service, volunteerism.
Maybe a little bit of shame in there too.
Yes, you know, it's time. You know, there's a wonderful collections, for example, of sermons that that the Puritan ministers would preach to to get the young men to volunteer because we need to go out to the frontier and fight off the whomevers this fall. And then after the French and Indian War, of course, famously, the British decided to leave their regiments here, which totally irritated all of the European colonists. In part because while the ranks weren't racialized, you had to be white or pass as white for the most part to serve in these. I mean, it's not even like they considered the options because there really weren't any. I mean, the 30% of the population that was black were slaves, and nobody wanted to arm the slaves. And the Native Americans were either hostile on the frontier or they were allied a lot, but then they fought as an allied military unit. They weren't integrated in any way. But the highest command positions were totally monopolized by British-born men, which irritated ambitious young officers like, for example, George Washington was really irked by his inability to rise further in the officer corps.
Sure. Anne?
Well, I think that for volunteer armies, again, if we go back to the European example, it's interesting because by the early 20th century, there are very few European countries that still have a volunteer army. Actually, Great Britain is really the only example of a country with a volunteer army that remains a volunteer army actually well into World War I. And that's why so many of the posters that we saw earlier are World War I British posters, precisely because they were the ones who other countries produced posters as well, recruitment posters. But for Britain, the ability to recruit for a volunteer army was particularly crucial. And it's interesting that at the time, there really was the sense that it was an obligation of everybody from every social walk of life. In fact, the elites were expected to take a lead to show sort of the other social classes that this is that this is their obligation. And this is one of the things that, of course, we're going to see change over the course of the 20th century. The perception whether or not elites should in fact serve. I mean, certainly in World War I, there was a huge the educated British elites were decimated in World War I, and that was one of the things contributing to the question of should they really should they be at the front lines, in fact? Is this the best way of utilizing the country's resources?
We do have some slides that will be coming up that will show sort of that glorification, as you called it, serve because it's your duty and your honor. When there is service required, does everyone really end up serving? I mean, are there ways to get out of it? I guess this is sort of the Dodger portion of the discussion. How do you get out of service if you're able to get out of it? Eleanor?
Okay, well, throughout the history both of the British colonies in North America and then the United States, yes, theoretically, the call to citizenship, I mean, it was written into state governing documents and then state constitution, colonial government documents, state constitutions, the federal constitution. I think the age range was something like 16 to 45, but they didn't really want everybody, right? They really only wanted you if you were about 18 to 25. That's who they wanted. So if you're just too old at the time, they don't really want you, or too young. And then if you perform any function that's considered vital, you have a skill or a trade or that's important to your community, then your community doesn't have to release you. If you're the village blacksmith, right, the village falls apart without you, so you don't have to go. You're the doctor, you're the lawyer, you're the shopkeeper.
Professor?
Sometimes.
Okay, good. Just checking.
But sometimes they, needed to demonstrate their manliness by going.
True.
The local minister was often but it was really kind of up to each community to decide who were the crucial men in that community who you needed to stay at home. And in fact, drafting, even in this period, was done at the local level. I mean, it was, a local committee of leading men would just, draw up lists and decide who the community could spare.
Mm-hmm. So, but you could, on the one hand, yes, if you held one of these vital jobs, you'd get to stay back. But in the reality, if you came from the right family, if you had enough money, could you have gotten out of service?
It would have because it's very community-oriented in the sense, it really would have depended, in a sense, here on whether your father thinks you should go or not. If he thinks you should go, you probably will. If he thinks you should stay home, you might not.
Well, Anne, let's talk about the Soviet Union. Slightly different case there?
Slightly. As far as draft dodging in the Soviet Union, I think the beauty of having, a semi-authoritarian or totalitarian, whatever terminology we want to use, regime is that it makes things like that a lot more difficult. There's certainly people not subject to the draft if they have a particularly valuable function to perform, but it's not the community that's going to make that decision. It's going to be the government, of course, that's going to make the decision whether somebody is too valuable to risk, to risk them being killed during wartime. And during peacetime, pretty much everybody during the earlier phases of the Soviet Union ended up having to serve. The situation changes dramatically in the last couple of decades of the Soviet Union and in present-day Russia, as the military sort of becomes somewhat more dysfunctional in the last years. And especially, of course, with the war in Afghanistan, where there was a very high risk that the service in the military would result in something really horrible happening to you. There's kind of greater and greater effort to avoid the possibility of having to serve in the military. One interesting example is that during the war in Afghanistan, if you were Jewish, actually, you'd be less likely to end up in Afghanistan because there was a concern that it would appear as if the Soviet Union is sending its Jews to be killed off in Afghanistan. So they were trying to be kind of sensitive to international opinion. In the present day, technically, all men from ages of 18 to 27 are subject to military service. 90% of those men manage to avoid it somehow. I mean, basically, if you end up in the military, it means that nobody was able to find an exception for you. And of course, it's very much tied to money. You can buy a medical certificate that says you have some kind of psychological problem or some other kind of problem to get you out. If you're a university student with a military faculty, you can say that you're getting your military training that way, which gets you out. If you teach at the military faculty, this is an excellent way to raise extra funds because basically you can sell these positions very, very nicely. Young men when there's a shortage, young men actually are rounded up. I mean, there have been cases where if you don't have proper papers and you're a young man of a certain age, you literally get stopped on the street and end up sort of having your head shaved and literally pressed into military service because the extent of avoidance is so great.
What intrigues me about this is it does not sound like military service is an honor then. I mean, it sounds almost like the opposite of being an honor in some respects. So is it an honor to serve? And we have some posters that actually play up whether or not it is an honor to serve, or at least sort of almost calls on it to be viewed as an honor. Is it an honor to serve? Anne?
Well, I guess I can sort of just finish that. In the Soviet period, right, it was the holy duty of it's sacred duty of every Soviet man to serve in the military. There was a tremendous amount of effort put into propaganda that was the case. And there's I think we have some evidence. I mean, it's always hard to evaluate, of course, how well that worked. But it appears that people took that quite seriously in the 20s, 30s, and of course, especially during World War II. After the war, the situation is perhaps not quite as honorable, but it's still not a significant problem. But in the later years of the Soviet Union, especially when all sorts of problems within the military are revealed, in particular kind of the really, really brutal hazing that leads to very bad things happening to young recruits, and especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the question of honor really dissipates. And this is one of the kind of paradoxes of people studying the contemporary Russia, is that on the one hand, there's a tremendous amount of rhetoric about patriotism and how much people love their country compared to everybody else, but that patriotism among men does not appear to translate into willingness to be in the army and to serve in the army, because the army, present-day Russian army, is extremely underfunded and dysfunctional, and as a result, this is not a good place. This is not a good place to be.
Let's talk about who leads the military. I think that's an important question for us to address. When it comes to military today, Rick, who do we find leading military down in Latin America?
Well, this is something that it changes over time. And actually, what's happening today is sort of a consequence of what happened in previous decades. But just a thumbnail sketch to go back. I mean, historically, military has played a role in Latin America in the sense of if they're discontent over some issue, they move into politics, may overthrow a leader, install somebody else. But what happened in the mid-20th century, in the period of the Cold War, really from the 1960s to 80s, we had military states. So the difference between this and what had happened previously the military had stepped in and then stepped out. Now it steps in. I mean, in Brazil you had from 1964 to 1985 a military state. Chile 1973 to 90. I mean, there's numerous countries. Uruguay, for 15 to 20 years you have so it's the military who rules. And part of that is explained by the issue of the Cold War. I know we're going to turn to that later, so I won't go into it. But now, so today what's happened is many of those military leaders, now we've moved to civilian rule since around the late 80s, the 90s, and we've had now more than, in the 21st century, civilian rule is the norm. One question comes up: how much power do the civilians have? Because there has been a big, like we had in South Africa, the truth commissions, and can we prosecute people for war crimes that they committed when they were in power? And pretty much, even though we have civilian rule, we can't. And these people have found ways to avoid being prosecuted, even though we do have civilian rule today. So they still are a power to be reckoned with.
Ian?
I mean, it's interesting because the way that we phrase the question is who leads the military, but of course, again, as the examples that were provided show, that sometimes it's the military that leads the state. But it's interesting that often, and certainly that's the case not just in Latin America. I mean, the best example, of course, outside of that, I think, would be Pakistan, right? The country that's primarily led by the military with brief civilian interruptions, and when the military kind of re-stepping in when it feels the civilian authorities have failed. But it's interesting when we look at European countries, the effort of civilian governments to try to make sure that the military does not, in fact, take over. Kind of, you have leaders, people, for example, if we take great, leaders like, great not necessarily as a, positive, negative, but great as in, powerful.
Yes.
Sure, effective. Let's take people like Mussolini or Hitler or Stalin, right? They all like to kind of to be seen as great military leaders, but technically they're not actually the military, right? So there is this fear that the military on the part of leaders like that to make sure that the military know their place, that the military does not, in fact, take over the government as a whole.
Mm-hmm. We have civilian leadership here, Eleanor.
Yeah.
Why? I think we've heard several good reasons why, but why?
Well, I mean, the generation that fought the revolution and wrote first the Articles of Confederation and then the Constitution, were very thoughtful men. And one of their great fear in terms of their understanding of government and its role and how it should be formed and what you expected it to do. And one of their great fears, of course, in their justification, one of their justifications for the revolution and independence in the first place was fear of tyranny. And, tyranny is one-man rule where he controls all of the functions of the state, the budget, executive decision-making authority, and the military. And so, in our famous various divided government systems, the idea was to make sure that the military was not ever in a position to achieve tyrannical control. And so...
And it's worked reasonably well for us for a couple hundred years.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, today when people think about military, they don't think just about sort of war and aggressive actions, but now we see a broader picture of what the military can do. Some of you've made allusions or mentioned some of these things. Some of those things are viewed positively, whether it's assistance after a flood or some sort of natural disaster. Some viewed very negatively, like jailing a rival leader. That obviously is not going to be viewed too positively quite often. Is there a general consensus for how domestic military involvement is viewed, or maybe how it should be viewed? Rick, let's start with you.
there's no consensus in Latin America. I mean, it's kind of mind-boggling. There's such division. Probably the best example would be the Chilean military dictator from 1973 to 1990, Augusto Pinochet. And he was unlike the other military leaders in that in the other countries they rotated leadership. He had it the whole time. Even after he left power, there would be huge groups that supported what he did, creating this military state, and had this huge backers. And there would be some I don't know if it's the current or previous president was somebody who was jailed under his leadership. So it's like on the one hand, there's this view, particularly in the 1970s and 80s, supporters of military rule, that it is to save the country from communism, chaos, etc. But on the other hand, there's this view that it's very repressive. So it's very polemical, and there's divided opinion. The more recent issue today would be the drug wars in places like more in Mexico, but also in Central America. Of course, we had them in Colombia. And on the one hand, the military has been asked to take on a much, much larger role. And it's almost like the new Cold War. And so what we see here, on the one hand, is some people say, well, we need protection from the drug lords and their power, their military, they're armed. But on the other hand, many people in Mexico say, we never should have done it. We're fighting a war we can't win. Over 30,000 people have been killed over the last 3-4 years. We have maybe about 100,000 soldiers working on this, and it seems like we've only inflamed things. So there's divided opinion.
Mm-hmm. Elma?
I mean, I think in the United States, you know, basically it sort of depends on the consequences. When they're helpful, everybody likes them, and if somebody dies and it's their fault, then it was terrible. And that's kind of, you know, it's very consequentialist, I think, the view in the United States. And the other thing to remember, and I don't think there's been a moment to pop this into the discussion, is, you know, up until the post-World War II period, the U.S. military was very tiny. You know, the standing military was scattered. It was, you know, divided into teeny little units on western posts. It had, you know, many people could go their entire lives and never knowingly meet an officer or soldier of the U.S. military unless it was wartime. And so, you know, nobody even thought about what role the military might have, because it was out there in the frontier doing frontier things, and it was, you know, very distant from most people's lives. After World War II and the launching of the Cold War, you know, the United States made the decision to keep a much larger standing military establishment than we'd ever had before, full-time professional soldiers. But huge numbers of them aren't in the United States. So again, it's really very distant for a lot of people.
Anne?
Well, I mean, the case of the Soviet Union and Russia, or Russia, Soviet Union and Russia, maybe is a really interesting one, because in some ways it provides such a striking contrast to the examples that Rick provided for Latin America. Before the 1917 revolution in Russia, the Tsar state utilized the military to deal with domestic disturbances. I mean, not that he didn't have wars to fight outside and external enemies to deal with, but using the military against civilian protesters was fairly common. And it was something that the army really did not like, especially towards the end of the 19th century. It's not so much that the army was disloyal or unpatriotic, but rather they felt that it was beneath them to be put to such use. And so one of the interesting things that we see as a result of this is in the Soviet period, there's very, very little use of the military for the purposes of dealing with domestic disturbances. I mean, there's kind of this line that the military is this glorious thing, and again, we saw already posters to that effect. The Soviet military is glorious, and it's there to protect the Soviet Union from the many, many, many external enemies. You know, some of which have already been mentioned. You know, United States, you know, all of these other places. Whereas there were other bodies within the Soviet Union that were designed to deal with domestic disturbances. There are a couple of small examples of the army being used that way, and it was covered up as much as possible, just because it was seen as something sort of anomalous and beyond the pale.
And certainly not honorific the way that they had been viewed up to that point. We've mentioned a lot of things that could trigger domestic think military intervention, have we missed anything? We've talked about natural disasters. We've talked about actual military intervention. Well, actually, we haven't really talked about protests a whole lot.
Right.
Rick?
Well, it seems if you're going to look at 20th century Latin America, the periods in which, well, throughout the century, there's been many military interventions. Sometimes the military will step back out. Sometimes, as I said, in the mid-century would stay in. Politics and protest can play a large role. The democratization movements in the 1910s, resulted in many military interventions to stifle them. And some of these movements can be engineered by protest groups, but you even get situations where, in the case of Chile, Salvador Allende was president from 1970 to 1973. He had been elected. It was his third time he had run. And he promoted a program really of socialist change. And so it can be run, a government-engineered shift that takes place, and that's going to inspire military intervention to stop that. The other thing to point out in Latin America is the Cuban Revolution. And what happens with the Cuban Revolution, it helps create this thing called the FOCO theory, which is this idea that just a few individuals together can create a revolution. And Castro had said they didn't quite know how many people were with him when we don't know when he revolted in the countryside, but he likes to say it was 12, right? So that imagery, you gotta admire that. And the point being that this is something else that can trigger military involvement. The claim that our country's being overrun by a link between the Soviet Union and Cuba, and it's true, Cuba did try to export that system to Che Guevara, who helped Castro with his revolution, went to Bolivia. And so sometimes the threat of, the threat of a guerrilla war can push this. Sometimes maybe it doesn't always start it, but what it does sometimes is that it helps legitimize continued military rule. And one point worth making is sometimes, as I talked about originally, the political movements, is that those political movements, once the military comes to power, they tend to attack things like organized labor. Because what had happened before the military rule around 1960 and 70, Latin America had went through a period in which there had been massive labor organization, kind of workers' rights had been promoted, and the military tended to squash down upon those things.
So over the last 100 years, really has the expectation of what the military does changed? I know we've covered a lot of that, but here's a chance for you to sort of encapsulate some of that. Eleanor, the last 100 years, how do you think the expectation of what military is supposed to do has changed?
Well, I think it really has more to do with our expectations of government changing and the services we expect from a government. And, you know, for the government, the organized military is a useful tool to use. For example, you know, before the 1870s, nobody ever responded to natural disaster. You were on your own. But once, you know, the idea becomes that maybe the government should respond, well, the government, here comes a natural disaster, who's ready to hand? And, well, the military is an organized body of men responsive to orders and reasonably disciplined, and so it's an effective tool. Although a little bit like Ann was talking about toward the end of the Tsarist period, you know, there were some experiments using state troops or federal troops in response to labor violence, that is the violence related to labor strikes that had gotten very hostile and very angry. And the military did not like being involved in those, because what would happen is they would arrive and, you know, calm everything back down, and the strike would inevitably fail at that point. And so then they just got blamed by everybody. You know, the labor movement didn't like them. Nobody else liked them because they hadn't got there soon enough, and they were the tool of, you know, they were the jackbooted thugs of the corporate class, and they decided that maybe they really just didn't want this job at all, and kicked it over to emergent state police forces. And you know, in the U.S. military, they've been pretty much out of that business ever since then.
Ann?
Well, I mean, to when we're thinking about the military, I think one of the interesting things that has changed also is the way that the soldiers within the military are seen, right? Not just the military as a body, but also the actions of specific of individual soldiers within it. And I think one great example is the perception of soldiers as simply blindly following orders, doing what the military orders them to do, versus a question of whether or not they have a responsibility to not do certain things. Kind of the most dramatic example, of course, that just following orders, right? The Nuremberg principles, where in the aftermath of World War II and the Holocaust, the idea that that I was following superior orders is not actually defense against war crimes. Of course, it's the most dramatic example, but the idea is that he places the responsibility to a certain extent on members of the military to put an end to certain practices because they themselves don't feel it's the right thing to do, because they know that they can't simply justify those because of superior orders. And it ties to our earlier conversations about the idea of an army based on citizens. That the army is not just as kind of something separate from society as a whole, but that they are part of society, and as a result, kind of cannot abandon certain beliefs and principles once they enter the military.
One of the things that a lot of people expect the military to do these days is actually sort of protect our economic interests. And there are a variety of ways that can be done. But let's start with sort of a general question. How large a role does the military really play in protecting economic interests abroad? We'll start with Eleanor.
Well, I mean, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright once asked, why have the military if you can't use it? And the leadership of the U.S. Army at the time was not enthusiastic about that question because they didn't want to go be used in the ways that she was suggesting. In part because sometimes, the role economically that a large military plays, like the one the United States has now, or for example the British had at the height of the imperial period, is simply by existing. Right? They are an advertisement of the power and authority of the metropole to enforce its will, or at least get its will a lot of the time. And in fact, that power is dissipated if they actually get sent out to do stuff, because that drains away their force in being as it's scattered about doing small things. And at that point, you get into the point of view expressed by the military historian Paul Kennedy, who argues that once militaries actually start getting used in active and engaged ways, the empire's doomed because it costs too much. And the return on the investment for the state is much too low.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Well, in terms of the topic of Latin America and foreign militaries used to protect their interests, I mean, that's a long topic. At the turn of the early 20th century, Charles Conant, who was a banker and an advisor, he worked to advise some countries to move to the gold standard. He talked about U.S. economic interest expanding abroad, and he said, the ideal is not to have to intervene and just have our interests protected just by the host government, but if need be, to open up trade routes or to protect our investments, militarism may be needed, and he actually referred to Latin America as one of the places that might need tutelage. And what we see in the 20th century is extensive U.S. intervention to protect U.S. economic interests. I mean, just to quickly list a couple of them. Interestingly, the case of Cuba, after the Spanish-American War, there were two political parties in Cuba, and one didn't come to power or the other via election. If one was in power, the other would create chaos. And they knew if they created chaos, the United States would intervene, and then that would bring them to the power. Then it was the other side's turn. I mean, the United States, the Marines occupied Nicaragua for about 20 years in the early century. They were at some extent trying to do away with a nationalist, Augusto Sandino, who was killed in the 1930s. Another interesting case would be Mexico. In the 1910 revolution, the 1917 Constitution allowed for the expropriation of foreign oil interests. Wilson was president. I know the United States intervened, but it was because of Pancho Villa. But but they ended up leaving after a few months. This was another issue where the oil interests were all, you got to invade. Wilson resisted. 1938, finally, Mexico nationalized the oil. the U.S. didn't intervene. How does that happen? Well, part of it was Roosevelt had the good neighbor policy. Part of it was that World War II was right there, so they escaped that. But if you take some other examples, in early 1950s, Jacobo Arbenz, maybe a socialist, a little hard to tell you what he was Guatemalan president. Land redistribution, they took place. There was talk about nationalizing some of United Fruit Company's lands. Some of the U.S. advisors there, John Dulles, had economic interest there. The U.S. didn't overthrow that government, but it helped with a local movement to do the same. The same thing happened in 1973 when Allende, the socialist president, was enacting reforms, and the United States government threw weight and power at the opposition, which eventually leads to the ousting of Allende. And generally speaking, the United States has supported the military, many of the military regimes, because they stood for order. And in addition to that, the United States put a lot of money into propping up military regimes in Central America, for instance, that were fighting brutal wars against rebels. So the United States not only has intervened, but has tried to help maintain certain governments that they saw as protecting their economic interests.
Actually, the military is a very, very large part of the economy. I don't think that anybody can disagree with that, especially here in a place like the United States. How large a part of the economy is it, Anne?
Large. I mean,
Next
I think
question. Large. Okay.
Well, I think that this is. I guess it depends on the time period that we're considering. And I think that we've all sort of been making allusions to the Cold War and kind of coming back to it. But I think that probably the second half of the 20th century is when we see a very dramatic rise in military spending, and of course not just in the United States, but in the Soviet Union as well. And you know, in the case of the Soviet Union, Soviet-style record keeping made it easier for them to make it appear as if a smaller percentage of their, of their budget was spent on the military, compared, of course, to the militaristic United States. Whereas the kind of the reality of the reality of the numbers is that there was a fair amount of parity in terms of percentages. I mean, I think in the Soviet Union, some have estimated up to 20% of total spending was on the military, kind of very relatively conservative estimate. In the United States, it fluctuated, right, but was very, very, very high through the Cold War.
And, well, even in the Cold War, it actually fluctuates at different points. I mean, it had gone down in the 70s. Carter actually began spending more money on the military, good Navy man that he was. Right? A lot of it went to the Navy. Shocking, I know. But so even in the U.S., it has fluctuated. But yeah, certainly since the Cold War, it's been a bigger piece of the budget. It began to grow even before that. I mean, right at the dawn of the 20th century, and the whole, the arms race of the era was who can build the biggest battle fleet, and those were expensive. So the money begins to play a role economically, particularly for those regions, that produce battleships. I don't know that Indiana saw a lot of that money at the time. So yeah, but I don't, and that's one of those things where, well, where does your accounting for what's the military expense stop, right? So I'm sure there's some ways you could run the numbers where it, could be even in the 30th or 40th percentile range, and others, if you focus just, specifically on hardware purchased for the use of the military and active duty salaries, it might be less than 20%.
But still, very major economic impact. When you talk about base realignment, for example, in the United States, regions get very excited because even if you simply stopped the military, it's all the support that comes to that, whether those are folks who do cleaning or the businesses that build up around it. It has a significant multiplier effect, as they say in the world of economics. We do from time to time see that things that were invented for military purposes find their way out into domestic use. Is this really the case in other countries? I mean, in the United States, obviously, we've seen plenty of inventions that were for military purposes that we now find some sort of domestic use for. Do we see this in other countries?
Well, I think, the Soviet example is maybe a short answer is Sort of, but not so much. In large part because so much of the Soviet Union's resources went towards the military. The consumer industry and consumer culture wasn't as well developed. So the kinds of things that we see in the United States, where things get developed for the military and then get sold for consumer, to consumers, that's simply not the case in the Soviet Union. But not necessarily for ideological well, I guess okay, it's ideological, but not because they're protecting that those things, but rather simply because the idea that you would develop, consumer culture is just not something that was part of kind of Soviet understanding of how the economy should run.
Mm-hmm. Rick, Brazil's sort of an interesting case here.
Well, it seems like Latin America, like if you take the case of the United States, when Hamilton initially tried to make us push for an industrial nation, it was based on we need to be able to defend ourselves, right? So Latin America, particularly the powers like Brazil and Argentina, they see being able to produce weapons, et cetera, as part of national defense. And that sort of happens the early to mid 20th century. What we see in Brazil today is Brazil is trying to compete with the other arms exporters. So, it sells a lot of jets and other military planes and hardware to Latin America, trying to branch out to other areas, as Brazil is sort of, one of these emerging nations. So that's sort of where it's trying to make its money more on exports of the military goods.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk now about paramilitary organizations. We've talked, when we say military, people have thought of, people who enlist or they're volunteers, they're conscripted, who knows how they got there, but they're carrying arms, they're serving as the purpose of military. But we also have several organizations that are what we would call paramilitary organizations, like a police force. Do countries find it important to differentiate between the two? And I think actually, Anne, we'll start with you, because you did mention that in the case of the Soviet Union, when there were the few times that the military came in and performed functions that the police were doing, that was not viewed positively.
I mean, I think in the Soviet case, you really have tremendous amount of effort into clearly differentiating the army, the armed forces versus police, and even within the police, the sort of regular police and secret police. And I know it may seem like a strange distinction in the Soviet case, but you have the army is the glorious institution that defends the Soviet Union, the citizens of the Soviet Union, from foreign aggressors. You have sort of the glorification of the police force. They're the benign, that's the benign guy on the street who makes sure the traffic runs a certain way and finds your lost kitten and puppy. And then there's the secret police, and there's not much said about the secret police, but they are they do all the unmentionable things. But it's interesting that that need to differentiate allows for the possibility of a genuine glorification of what we would probably, the best way to think of it is the beat cop, right? The beat cop is the nice guy, and there's and they're seen as a genuinely, both in propaganda, but genuinely seen as a potentially as a positive force. And then the secret police is the group that you don't talk about, and they're the ones who perform those unsavory functions that most people have a hard time sort of getting particularly happy about.
Mm-hmm. Eleanor?
Well, at least in the United States, but this is also true in Great Britain and to a certain degree also, to some degree, Germany and France. I mean, the police come from a different place than the military. Their origins are different, their histories are different, they understand their function in society to be quite different. I mean, it's one of the reasons that, for example, in the United States, military forces, either the State Guard or the Federal Army, didn't like being involved in labor disputes because they said this is a policing function. This is not these are not our enemies. These are not people that we want to kill, and that's what we do, right? That's what a military ultimately is trying to do. And so, the hard work of keeping order, figuring out who's who, stopping confrontations before they become deadly, that's really a completely different skill set, and really needs to be handled by people coming from a different place. And at the same time, modern professional policing was developing mostly out of urban politics and big city politics, in the sense that, the city is perceived of as dangerous, but if you want the city to continue to make money, people need to feel safe, and the answer to that is almost an expansion of the traditional night watchman idea. Again, the beat cop. And that's where the idea of the beat cop comes from, is that you want people circling the street wearing a clearly identifiable uniform, who get to know the neighbors, right? And the people and the shopkeepers who will come report to them, oh, that little Johnny's causing more trouble. You need to talk to his mom. And this kind of vision for policing and community service is very different than what the military does. I mean, to some degree, certainly in the 20th century, less happy military foreign adventures, for example, Vietnam or the current ones in Iraq and Afghanistan, one of the defenses that the U.S. military will put forward is that ultimately what they're being asked to do is a police function, and that's ultimately not what they're trained for, and it's not what they're good at, and they're not, as a result, doing a particularly good job with it.
Adding one quick point to that, in the case of Mexico, they actually are doing somewhat similar things. They're working on domestic issues, but one of the differences would be, in terms of the drug war, the argument is the police force is so corrupt that it cannot fight it. Therefore, the professional military needs to be the one to do that. And there's been all these attempts to clean up the police force where actually thousands of officers were dismissed, even in the last 2-3 years. But it's a case where the functions can overlap because it's so domestic related, but one is perceived as more corrupt than the other.
Well, let's talk for a moment about this concept of martial law. Eleanor, I'm going to ask you to kind of define martial law. Give us a simple working definition, and I'll ask Rick and Ann to give us some examples. Martial law, theoretically, could be good, could be bad, depends on the reason for it being declared. So what's sort of a working definition of martial law?
Well, martial law is when you invite a military organization in and give the commander the authority to control the area as though it were a military base, essentially, right? It's one-man rule. He makes all the rules, imposes curfews, for example, that, civilian leadership doesn't impose. In fact, in a place like the U.S., we wouldn't dream of imposing unless you're under 18, but we don't need to get into juvenile law right now.
That's a subject for another show.
And crowd control. You get to violate what are normally considered to be, irrevocable civil rights, the right to meet and gather in public spaces, to speak publicly, because on a military base, which is military property, the officer corps gets to make all those choices. And so when they're invited in to take control of an area and impose martial law, then the whole area is essentially considered, for the time being, the property and the responsibility of military authorities to make the rules as they see fit, and policed and patrolled by armed soldiers.
Ann?
Well, I think certainly looking at it as a Soviet historian and looking out towards Europe in the second half of the 20th century, I mean, there are a number of very striking examples of the use of martial law precisely to, in a distinctly non-positive way. I mean, the government uses it as a last resort. I mean, the most dramatic case would be perhaps Poland 1956, Poland 1981. Where the government relies on martial law as a way to quell, domestic discontent. In the case of Poland 1981, some have suggested that martial law was introduced by the Polish government in order to be able to prevent the Soviets from rolling their tanks in and imposing kind of martial law of their own. So I think that there's it's a desperate act of a government, and it's very rarely seen as a positive by society.
Right.
Well, today there's some discussion of implementing martial law in Mexico and in Guatemala, the justification being the drug war, and we don't have it, but there's been some discussion of it. What we find interesting, I think, in the case of Latin America, particularly the military regimes, is that in theory, you'd have something that sounds like martial law. They curtailed freedom of expression, freedom of the press, freedom to gather, freedom to protest. And during this period also, in many countries, you had the disappeared, where maybe 10,000 people in Chile, Argentina, the government disappeared them. We don't know. A lot of them in Chile were taken to this national palace and stored there, and many of them were killed or tortured, and that's a fact. So the military government took on these greater powers, which sound a little bit like martial law because of this era of, they claim, chaos. But in the Chilean case, they revised the Constitution. So it was constitutional. They created a whole new constitution that gave the government greater powers and I don't think, technically speaking, that would be martial law. Right?
Very oppressive in much the same way.
Right. Yeah. But it's just we have a constitution, you know, and the Constitution says this, and we're following it. Certainly extremely oppressive, and what you would associate with curfews and things like that, which sound exactly like martial law, function like martial law, but aren't called martial law.
Well, it seems like, I mean, the fact that what Rick was describing technically wasn't martial law because there were new laws passed to deal with it. I mean, it suggests that martial law is seen as such a, I mean, it's a last resort, right? And so, you know, regimes want to make sure, when you have to rely on that, it suggests that there's something seriously fundamentally wrong going on. So if that means you write a new constitution to make sure that you technically don't invoke that, I mean, it's kind of a very powerful statement about how the perception of the concept of martial law.
So just as a couple of questions to close up here, when we look at the types, the scope, the breadth of domestic military action in one country, how does that influence how other countries view each other? In other words, if you're a country that's known for a very active and aggressive military, does that influence things if you're known for declaring martial law or simply rewriting your constitution so that it's not martial law? How do other countries, how does that influence the way countries interact with one another? Let's start with Eleanor.
Well, I think it plays a huge role in how countries perceive you. I mean, in the history of the United States, you know, up until we finally, in the post-World War II period, have a big army, you know, one of the challenges the federal government and many American business and financial elites felt in trying to act internationally was that the United States didn't have enough military heft and that they had trouble getting their way as a result. You know, that, you know, they would want something and the British and the French and the Germans would be like, you know, you in what army? And they'd say, oh, we don't have one. And they'd say, well then, that's the end of that conversation. So yeah, of course, it makes a huge difference, just simply the capacity to do something and then what you do with it. I mean, at this point, I think the United States is perceived to be a highly militarized country when that was not, in fact, always part of our history. It's a relatively new development as a result of the Cold War.
Anne?
Well, I mean, certainly I think that...
Since Eleanor mentioned the Cold War, it just seemed like a natural segue.
Of course. I mean, the interesting thing, of course, is that, you know, one of the things that we see during the Cold War is sort of the efforts by the two superpowers to increase their militaries, you know, and in order to achieve some kind of parity, however that may be defined. And so as a result, I mean, you have, I think some interesting examples would be, you know, each side wanted to depict its military as defensive and a freedom, you know, freedom-saving, freedom-promoting force around the world, and its opponent as completely the opposite. And of course, the event of the Cold War gave each side plenty of ammunition to do so. The Soviet propaganda had a field day with Vietnam. I mean, I know it sounds like a horrible way of phrasing it, but I mean, you know, this allowed the Soviet Union to emerge as a peace-loving country that was only simply pointing to those horrible things that the American military is doing in Vietnam. Of course, you know, the United States had its chance to have a field day with Afghanistan, right? And it's interesting that the Soviet Union achieved a tremendous amount of kind of international moral capital as leading the peace movement, you know, or being seen as leading the peace movement against the United States and Vietnam, and they managed to squander that really, really almost immediately as a result of their invasion of Afghanistan and their perception and kind of the complete change in the way that they were perceived around the world.
Right.
Well, I would say that in the period of the Cold War, if we're thinking about the United States in its position vis-a-vis Latin America, it's true that different presidents have different stances. Carter was different and was a little more concerned in some ways with militarism than Reagan was, but it seems to me what the issue for the United States is the Cold War and the domino theory, and whether a regime is military or not is not the principal issue. Is it whether they're in our camp or whether they're in their camp? Because we recognized military governments which were throughout the region, which were very brutal. I mean, the biggest case would be the Guatemalan case, where it's estimated a couple 100,000 Indians were killed in the fighting. But you take all the military governments in South America, our camp within the Cold War, and we gave them military funding. And Cuba would be a case where it was in the other camp, so we didn't recognize them. And did it have oppressive tendencies? Yes. But if you were going to compare the militarism in the death squads, the ones in Cuba are minuscule compared to these other countries that we supported. So I think it had more to do with the Cold War divide as opposed to militarism within a country.
What do your understandings of domestic military action do for your particular insights or conclusions you draw about individual governments, cultures, societies, whatever part of that you want to take on? It's a very large question, I'm sure, but how does it shape your understanding of the way a country acts when you understand their domestic military programs? Eleanor?
I'm trying to. The question, I guess, confused me just a little bit.
When you are understanding a country, when you're studying a country, whether it's as a historian or just in present time, when your understanding of domestic military programs, what insights about the culture of that country do you draw because of your understandings of the domestic military program?
Well, I guess actually I would be less interested in their formal program, because right now, for example, in North, South, and Central America, their formal programs are all quite similar. You know, that there's a formal separation between the military and the civilian leadership, and you know, the military is small and it's professional, it's professionally trained, and it's sworn to uphold the Constitution, and that's all quite, you know, as an aspiration, that's all very similar. So what you're more interested then is, well, what actually happens? Which isn't, I guess,
Well, that's an interesting way to put it. There's what's written down, and there's what the practical application of it. Rick?
Well, what I would say, and I think that's exactly right, but I would say if you look at the case of Latin America, what's kind of interesting, it seems to me that in terms of domestic role, Latin American militaries have played an immense role. And I think part of it we can explain not just because of the Cold War and the fear of communism, but it's also a consequence of failures and problems, perceived problems about social development, about economic development. So given that void or those problems, and also given the fact that in the early 20th century, the military leaders, some of them were more highly educated than the civilian elite, and also that they embraced programs which conceived their role as broader, and not in all countries. Mexico would be, you know, there's counterexamples, but in many countries, as broader than just protecting the nation from foreign threats, but actual national development. I mean, part of national security is economic development. So you put all that together, and I think it helps explain why the military has played a significant role in domestic development in Latin America. And you know, you talk about the military leaders, and they're all talking about economics and development plans, and some of them more nationalist than others, for nationalizing foreign industry to benefit the country. So I would say that someone had to come, the military felt like that the civilian leadership wasn't up to the task. And one of the complaints, too, is that politicians bicker. The case with Chile was great. How did Chile, you know, they're having a debate today about how to, you know, should we weaken the union, shouldn't we? How much power should the individual have? How much power should the corporation? When Pinochet came to power in 1973, he beat Reagan, he beat Margaret Thatcher, he listened to the guys, the Chicago boys, the free marketers. He listened to them, they got his ear. This is what we're doing. They switched from socialism to free market capitalism on a dime, and this is more efficient. You know, so I think that, I mean, there was a lot of consequences to that, but the point being that this is his perspective, and the failings of these countries, of course, helped the military come to take a greater role, I would say.
Anne? I know you're all for government efficiency.
I am all for government efficiency. But actually, what I agree with the points that Eleanor and Rick raised, but I also want to bring up sort of the social and cultural impact, social and cultural aspect of thinking about the military. the issues. What's interesting to me is the way that discussions about the military, the role that the military plays, whether domestically or externally, the way that these developments mirror the development of civil society as a whole, right? The issue of citizenship and military service. This is gradually becoming accepted, and then questions are raised about who constitutes, who's a citizen, right? Questions about, do women get to serve? Is it their duty, or is it an obligation? Questions about, African Americans serving in the military, of course, in the case of the U.S. Currently, the issues dealing with homosexuals in the military, right? I mean, all of these questions, in a sense, deal with the broader discussions that we have in our society, and they play within the military in a very, very interesting way. And this raises a question of what kind of a force is the military, right? Oftentimes, we assume that the military is a more conservative force, but it's interesting to see that that doesn't always have to be the case, right? There have been cases where you see the military as a force for change, but not always negative, not always more brutal and repressive, but sometimes it actually paves the way for social change. One of the last images that were shown, the image from the Soviet propaganda poster from Afghanistan, is a great example of that, where it's the experience in the military that led a lot of people to kind of criticize the government more and more, and was one of the contributing factors, not the only one, of course, but contributing factor to the collapse of the Soviet Union. In Israel, members of the military, not a lot of them, but some of them have started questioning some of the Israeli policies, and it's precisely because they have served in the military that gives them the opportunity and kind of the platform to be able to criticize the government in the way that those who have not served in the military can't really question it. So it can go in multiple directions, but I think it's very interesting.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. We had as our guests, starting on my left, Eleanor Hanna from the Department of History, and Liv Shiz also from the Department of History, and Rick Weiner from the Department of History. Thank you very much for joining us. I want to thank CATV for recording this for us. I also want to thank MDON for making it available throughout the internet and through the library's website. Once again, this was a part of a series on state and local governments brought to you by the American Democracy Project here at IPFW and the Departments of History and Political Science.